All right, good morning. Welcome back from spring break. This is the first World War II lecture, and in it you will find the answers for pages 11 and 12 and part of 13 in your World War II packet. So here we go. All right. Oh, not working. Why won't? There we go. Okay. So we've already talked about the Great Depression. We talked about that some before we left school. Production is down. We've got a lot of people unemployed. We've got people who are struggling. We've got no markets for people to buy things. They don't have money to buy things. So the economy is struggling. And even with the efforts of the first and the second New Deal, it's not making the changes necessary to make the economy as successful as it needs to be. Americans are not interested in being involved in another foreign war. They feel like Europe's issues are Europe's issues and not our issues. And they practice isolationist policy through Congress by passing neutrality acts and trying to keep ourselves separate. FDR knows that this is not going to work and that we're going to have to get involved in some point. But for the most part, we are concerned with fixing the economic and social issues in our own country and not in what's going on in Europe. So the war really starts in 1937 with the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. There's a false flag operation, which means the Japanese set it up to look like the Chinese attacked them first, but that's not what happened. And they take Manchuria, they take Korea, they start invading other areas, and they're committing horrendous human rights violations as they go. If you're interested in learning more about that, take the World War II course, because the depth and the scope of this class is just not enough to get into that. At any rate, we have Germany suffering under the restrictions of the Versailles Treaty. They don't have their mining areas and things like that. They don't have access to the money and resources of their colonies. And when Hitler comes to power, he basically says, I'm going to tear up this Versailles Treaty. And the issue is that the other nations are involved in solving their own economic problems, and people don't want to get into another war, so we ignore Hitler for far too long. All right, so as he starts to build up the military, England and France aren't doing anything, and we certainly aren't doing anything either. Italy has a fascist leader, that's Benito Mussolini, and he and Hitler become allies. Again, we're not enemies with them at this point. So Hitler starts shifting social policy, and he announces what's called Lebensraum, which means living room. Now, living room or Lebensraum is a very historic term. You don't call your realtor and say, hey, I need some Lebensraum, right? That's not appropriate. So according to them, the plan was that they were going to move non-German people, and Jewish people lost their citizenship, would be moved to Eastern Europe, to the further reaches, and then Germans would be able to populate Germanic areas as per the Holy Roman Empire. But what we know happens is that they instead have concentration camps and labor camps and, eliminate and eradicate populations of Slavs and Jews across Europe. So Hitler invades, or annexes really, it's not really an invasion, people are waving Nazi flags and standing there as the troops roll in, the western part of Czechoslovakia, which is now the Czech Republic and Slovakia. And so this is sort of like a heads up, because it wasn't like long disputed territory, it was an independent nation. So Hitler and Neville Chamberlain, he's the Prime Minister of England, have an agreement, and Hitler promises not to take any more land, and England is relieved, they don't want to go to war, but he takes the rest of Czechoslovakia anyway. We also see an uptick in human rights violations in Germany with Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, where they burn synagogues and destroy Jewish businesses and kill and maim people in the streets, and that's November 6, 1938. So Americans are not interested in being involved in this war. It's a European problem. Let them solve it. So we passed the Neutrality Acts in order to prevent the United States from becoming involved. Now, keep in mind, FDR knows that we're headed down this path. He's talking on the phone to Winston Churchill, who becomes the prime minister once war is declared in England. They're talking on the phone almost every day, and Churchill's asking for help. And so we do what we can, but it's not a lot, honestly, at the beginning. We do have Nazi sympathizers in the United States. The America First group, which was supported by famous people like Charles Lindbergh. We had the American Bund, who were American Nazis, and they had Nazi rallies and Nazi marches and all kinds of stuff. And that stuff's not going to go away until we declare war. So, despite the fact that, on the surface, everyone is against going to war in the United States, Roosevelt knows what's coming, and so he starts, establishing, we've got 2 navies instead of just one. We got a Pacific Fleet and an Atlantic Fleet. He starts building the military surplus. He starts reorganizing the Selective Service Act because he knows what's coming. So September 1st, 1939, Germany invades Poland, and then the Soviet Union will invade Eastern Poland a few days later because they have a secret agreement which we weren't aware of. And at that point, that's when England declares war on Germany, and World War II, as we know it, is established. So Germany takes over Norway, like the Nordic states. They take over Denmark, Belgium, France. And for a long time, it's really just Great Britain fighting Germany alone. And the Germans are bombing London, bombing Britain, bombing industrial sites, with the plan of doing a soft invasion, or an amphibious invasion, onto the island of Great Britain. But that doesn't happen because the RAF and Canadian Air Force are able to hold off the Germans and destroys much of the Luftwaffe, which is the German Air Force. All right, so we start the draft. We mobilize 1.4 million men to get ready because we know what's coming, as I said. All right. In March 1941, we have the Lend-Lease Act, which is designed to give our allies or nations that we're sympathetic to access to weapons that they can't manufacture or don't have money for. We are the manufacturing powerhouse. This is our golden moment. We manufacture and create. We made as much in one day of manufacturing as all the European allies made in the course of the war, which is pretty phenomenal. So, we were necessary for this war to be won, but so were the Russians, and we'll talk more about that later. All right. So here's page 11 of your document. Issues of mobilization, and I'm sorry I spelled it wrong. How do we pay for it? These are your questions there. How do we access enough raw materials? How do we make weapons fast enough? How do we get the food that we need to support both the troops and the people at home? How do we regulate information to the public, right? We need that propaganda machine. We learned about that in World War I. And how do we keep manufacturing at its peak when all the men are going to be overseas and serving in the military? All right, so let's answer those questions. How are we going to pay for it? Combination of a restructuring of the tax system and the sale of war bonds. We talked about war bonds in World War I. It's the same idea. Citizens buy a certificate, and after a certain amount of time has passed, that certificate is worth more money. So it's basically a short-term loan to the U.S. government. How do we get raw materials? Recycle. Recycling was big. We had recycling drives. You collected everything, rusty bicycles, lipstick tubes, anything you can think of that was metal. We stopped producing things like women's nylons because we need the nylon to make parachute fabric. What else do we do? Fat. We recycle fat, like kitchen fat. Anybody got a grandma with a jar of bacon grease under the stove or under the kitchen sink in the cabinet? Right? You save your fat, your cooking fat, to for the insides of the explosive devices. So, we were recycling. That was like a Boy Scout thing. Get out and recycle. Collect all the materials. How do we make weapons fast enough? Well, you're not going to find a 1943 Ford because all the factories were repurposed for military production using the Defense Production Act, which forced companies to produce military equipment, clothing, shoes, uniforms, bullets, weapons, planes, whatever it is. And it's, if you've been listening to the news, this is something that some politicians have been talking about, the Defense Production Act, because this would be a way for the Trump administration to have, the materials that we need to beat the coronavirus, like ventilators and the PPE materials, produced quickly and without exorbitant cost. But he has hesitated to do that. What company? GM actually partnered up with a ventilator producer, and they brought back 1,000 employees because they've been shut down because of the virus. 1,000 employees, retrained them, and have retooled the factory to make ventilators. And they did so at their own, their own intuition did it. They did it for Americans. So they are moving ahead without the president's blessing, and we're thankful for that. How do we get enough food? We ration food. People have ration books. They can't buy everything that they want. They can only buy limited amounts. And people are encouraged to grow what's called a victory garden. And people now are doing the same thing. The food supply isn't guaranteed, and we've learned that the hard way. So what's the solution? The solution is grow your own food. Chickens provide eggs and meat. You grow your own vegetables and your grain crops. And then there's more food in the food supply for the troops in this case of the war. But in our case now, this way we can supply ourselves with food and we don't have to go to the grocery store. All right. How do we regulate information? We use the Office of War Information, which is a propaganda machine. And we'll talk more about that in the next lecture. I don't want to get too far into it because I like to keep these short so you can take a break. And then how do we fill these jobs? How do we keep manufacturing at its peak? Well, we shift to 3 work shifts a day, 8 hours each. The factories run 24 hours a day. And when the men leave to go fight overseas, primarily white men, because there's still segregated units, then they hire women, African Americans and Latino Americans, to come work in the factories. Does that cause labor strife like the last time in World War I? Absolutely. Yes, it does. Race riots and problems and racism and sexism and all kinds of things. But, the job still gets done. All right, we're going to stop there. Whoop, whoop. Okay. And get that information for those packet pages, and then I'll get the next video out as soon as possible to get the next set.